a MintPress live stream with me, Lowkey, today. As usual, you will see me on the Watchdog podcast, but today we have an almost live version of the podcast. We're joined also by one of my favorite journalists today, Alan MacLeod. And also we have the brilliant help from Manar Adli from MintPress in the background helping us today. It is important that everybody knows that MintPress is independent media in a world where the space for independent media is shrinking on a daily basis. So I would implore all of those watching this live stream today to join us, support us on Patreon, to please like, subscribe, and share this video. Now, all of us would have no doubt seen the pictures coming out of Al-Aqsa in occupied Palestine. If not, we're just now going to load up for you some videos of the events which have transpired there. Thank you very much, Manan.
وين الكرسي هذا؟ وقف عم الحاج. حاج حاج خاف توقف. حاج إذا أنا مش حاسس فيهم وقف. لو سمحت. بتصلي الله أكبر بتصلي.
Thank you for that, Manan. Thank you. Credit to Eye on Palestine for the video there. What we are seeing is the Israeli army invading the Masjid al-Qibli in the Al-Aqsa compound. We've seen almost 100 people injured in that process. We've seen journalists shot in the head with rubber bullets. Nisreen Salim from Al-Qasd Media. In addition to that, we have seen journalists attacked and many unarmed people jumped on. The footage has come out. I feel the important context to this, which has to be pointed to, is the activities of an organization by the name of the Temple Institute. Now, the superiority which Israel is establishing over Al-Aqsa, the Israeli army establishing the norm that it can enter when it likes, is part of this Temple Institute push. Now, the Temple Institute is an organization which explicitly states that its intention is to bring down Al-Aqsa and rebuild the third temple. Now, this is quite a dangerous proposition. But when we also understand that the Temple Institute is not an isolated organization which doesn't enjoy support, then we see quite how serious the situation will become. If we think what we have seen over the last 24 hours is anything, then if the Temple Institute get their way, then we will see a lot worse than that. Now, this organization, it was revealed in Haaretz, is not only funded by the Israeli Education Ministry, but it's also funded by the Deputy Defense Minister of the Israeli state, Eli Ben-Dahan. We have also seen the new Israeli ambassador to Britain, Hotevli, support them very, very closely. In addition to that, the money from the Ministry of Education, the Israeli Ministry of Education, adds up to over 2.2 million shekels. Again, that was released by Haaretz. Also, you have seen many US tax exempt charities direct money towards the Temple Institute. For example, the One Israel Fund. You also have other organizations like the PEF Israel Endowment Fund directing money towards the Temple Institute. Also, the Lillian Jean Kaplan Foundation. Now, the son of Lillian Jean Kaplan is Thomas Kaplan, who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He also started an organization with David Petraeus by the name of the Recanati Kaplan Foundation Fellows Program for intelligence officers from all over the planet. These are the types of forces which are behind this organization, who, as I say, its stated intention is to bring down Al-Aqsa and replace it with a third temple. Also, another funder of the Temple Institute is Henry Swaker, who's also funded the Friends of the IDF and the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which employed Tommy Robinson. We must have an awareness about what the future may hold, especially when we're looking at the amount of money and resources which is being pumped into an organization like the Temple Institute. We've also seen the news that the British government now has put the infrastructure in place, is gradually putting the infrastructure in place to move people who have tried to come into this country to Rwanda for processing. That will mean detention in Rwanda. Now, a lot of people are not aware that on the 24th of November 2021, 27 people drowned in the English Channel trying to enter this country. And actually, following that, the relatives of those who died made an official complaint to the British government for negligence. Now, they have asserted that they were following the movement of the ship on the English Channel of refugees, many from Iraqi Kurdistan, that had reached UK maritime territory around 1 a.m. This is the claim of many of the relatives and some of the survivors. Now, it was at this point that the UK Coast Guard is believed to have received 90 different alerts from the people holding on to the side of this boat. It's then believed that the people held on the side of the boat until the sunrise, and the UK Coast Guard helicopter took flight at around 3:46 a.m. That was 2 hours and 46 minutes after the boat is believed to have stopped functioning. Now, the relatives of those who died are so certain that the UK government has some type of responsibility for the death of their loved ones, for this organized abandonment, one could say, that they have banded together with another organization in France to bring a case for involuntary manslaughter against Her Majesty's Coast Guard. So, in a sense, we see now the turning over of the control of the English Channel from Her Majesty's Coast Guard to the Royal Navy. And it's important to remember that as this bid at threat inflation is pumped up further and further, that people in this country who have been given asylum only equate to 0.18% of the population. If they do have recourse to public funds, it's £37.75 weekly. That is just over £5 a day. And let's not forget that over 1 million people in this country do not have recourse to public funds. Priti Patel, on the other hand, was paid £1,000 per hour as an advisor to Viasat. This is the technology company whose systems are used all over Royal Navy warships. And also, it's important to remember that now the person put in charge of the English Channel for the Royal Navy is John Craig, the Commodore, commander of the UK Carrier Strike Group at the Royal Navy. Now, this was somebody who fought as part of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. This was, of course, the war of around 20 years, which displaced millions of people. He's someone who was trained at the Naval Command College in the US Naval War College. So now what we're seeing is the very same people that were involved and that benefited from the war on terror, now part of keeping out those people who have no doubt been displaced by the war on terror. Now, we are joined by one of my favorite journalists today, Alan MacLeod, who's a staff reporter at MintPress, who has written several books and has a PhD. And I'm very much looking forward to him joining us. Thank you to those who have donated to MintPress. We would definitely encourage you to do that more and join the Patreon. So, Alan, please feel free to enter the live stream.
Hey, how's it going, Lowkey? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see you. Unfortunately, I cannot see your wonderful fringe. We have been deprived of its presence today, it seems. Do you care to explain the absence of your fringe today, Alan?
My hair's getting pretty long, so sometimes I have to brush it to the side or brush it up or something, yeah, to keep it out of my eyes. So I've decided not to go with the Beatles look today.
Right. I'm sure many will be deeply, deeply disappointed about that, Mr. MacLeod. So if you could start with Alan, could you just break down for us what is the National Endowment of Democracy? What is the NED?
Well, the NED was created in the early 1980s by the Reagan administration, and it was created in the shadow of a number of CIA scandals which had come out during the 1970s and had really ruined that agency's reputation. And so the Reagan administration envisaged an organization that was semi-private and therefore not applicable to the same sort of scrutiny or freedom of information requests that could do the dirty work for the CIA without attracting very much of the scrutiny. And since then, that is what the NED has been set up to do. Its co-founder, Carl Gershman, said that a lot of the work that was done covertly by the CIA 25 years ago is now done openly by the NED. And that's really the point. It's a sort of halfway house between the government and private industry. And the NED has carried out a lot of the dirtiest regime change operations across the world. In Cuba last year, organized a group of artists and intellectuals to trigger a nationwide protest with the aim of overthrowing government. In Venezuela, it's given funds to various right-wing forces that have tried to prosecute coups. In Belarus, there's 40 different NED projects going on right now, all with the aim of overthrowing the government there. And it goes along all around the world like this. The NED doesn't actually operate very much in Western Europe, and it doesn't operate at all in the Middle East in countries like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Qatar, states that are friendly with the United States government. And that is precisely because the NED is basically the regime change arm of Washington, and it has been like that for decades.
Can I just note how impressed I am at your pronunciation of Bahrain? That is quite rare for a non-Arabic speaker to be able to pronounce Bahrain in the way that you did. So that's great. Now, Alan, could you also break down for us what is the European Endowment for Democracy?
Well, as the name suggests, the European Endowment for Democracy was set up as a sort of, I don't want to say a counterweight, but it was certainly set up in the image of the National Endowment for Democracy. And it is basically the EU's regime change arm. It operates in much the same way as the NED, whereby the European Union will allocate funds to the European Endowment for Democracy. And then the European Endowment for Democracy will find projects, groups, political parties, media outlets, organizations, NGOs, etc., which will carry out operations in the interest of the European Union out with the European Union. It primarily operates in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa region. And of late, it's been very active in Ukraine right now, actually.
So that leads us really on to the next question. Can you tell us about the development of Kiev Independent?
Yeah, sure. So for those not in the know, the Kiev Independent is a very new media outlet which has really shot to prominence over the last few weeks. And the reason for that is because not only do social media giants like Twitter constantly promote it, but it's also being signal boosted by some of the biggest legacy media outlets that there are. Kiev independent writers are given spots to write op-eds in the pages of the New York Times and Washington Post. Their funding drives are promoted by big outlets like CBS or PBS. Or you could see, if you turn on cable news, you will see Kiev independent reporters there constantly. They're on Fox News, they're on CNN, they're on CBS, ABC. Pretty much every news channel has a Kiev independent reporter on there at least a few times. Now, they present themselves as this new startup, which are totally independent, and you can, trust their unbiased sourcing. But really, when you start looking at who the Kiev Independent are, where their funding comes from, and some of their key operatives, it certainly gets a lot murkier. And we might start to think, actually, maybe they're not quite as independent as they seem. So we were talking about the European Endowment for Democracy earlier. The Kiev Independent split from their old organization. It was called the Kiev Post. They had a big disagreement with management, and 30 of their staff walked out in November to form the Kiev Independent. And they were able to do this because they got an emergency grant from the Canadian government through the European Endowment for Democracy. It was 200,000 Canadian dollars at least. And with this, they were able to pay their staff's wages and start up their website and continue their reporting. So already we've got a little bit of a strange situation whereby we really talk about independent media. It tends to be a very low bar we set. Independent tends just to mean free of government ownership or government money. But even at this level, the Kiev Independent fails. You should also have a look at who the Kiev Post was funded by as well. So the Kiev Post, if anything, their funding sources are even more hair-raising. They are directly funded by NATO, they're directly funded by European governments, and they're also directly funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. So we have a situation where these independent journalists, supposedly at the Kiev Independent, for years, they will have had their wages paid either by NATO or by the National Endowment for Democracy, or now through the European Endowment for Democracy. And when you look at some of the people who work for the Kiev Independent, it's also very surprising who they employ. So, for instance, their contributing editor used to work at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. Their podcast producer used to work at the American Embassy in Kiev. There's also Kiev independent reporters who used to work for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which, as I think many people watching this know, was set up by the CIA in the 1970s and was called a worldwide propaganda network by the New York Times, no less. And yet these are the journalists who work for the Kiev Independent and are being, constantly signal boosted, whether it's on television or radio or in your newspapers. They're constantly being signal boosted as the people to listen to when it comes to Ukraine, because they are so unbiased and their information is so factual. And yet when you start looking at this into any kind of detail, it starts looking like it's some sort of op that's being run by Western governments to try to create a sort of propaganda blitz on Western publics. Into thinking that this war is completely black and white. I do completely reject Russia's invasion, but that doesn't mean to say that absolutely everything was perfect about Ukraine beforehand. It's not Russian propaganda to acknowledge that there is a very big problem with the far right in Ukraine, as most corporate media was saying up until a few months ago. And that even extends to the Kiev Independent itself, where its star reporter is the defense reporter, Ilya Ponomarenko. He has multiple times on social media declared himself a, quote, consecrated, unquote, member of the Azov battalion, who are famously this neo-Nazi militia, which have now been formally incorporated into the Ukrainian defense forces. And so we really have this situation where obviously truth is the first casualty in war, but it's not just the Russian side that are putting out propaganda. There's also a lot of propaganda coming from Western governments and coming from within Ukraine itself. And I think it's very important for people in the West to understand that, so they can really have a good, unbiased, and clear view of what's going on there right now.
Yes, Alan, and people can see this brilliant investigation by Alan MacLeod on MintPress. As a small side note, Alan, could you just give us a little bit more of information about the Atlantic Council? Because this is quite a significant think tank that, you know, when you often look at the blue ticks with significant followings on Twitter, for example, you'll almost always find it leading back to, especially those in these situations, talking about what's happening in Ukraine. They seem to be afforded a veneer of objectivity. But when it leads back to the Atlantic Council, this is almost a way to obfuscate about what their um, their sources of funding are, and also where their loyalties may lie. So if you could just give us a bit of information about the Atlantic Council, please.
Yeah, sure. In short, the Atlantic Council is the brains behind NATO. It is NATO's semi-official think tank. Of course, the A in NATO stands for Atlantic, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Atlantic Council is staffed by former NATO generals or high-ranking officers directly funded by NATO, produces policy reports suggesting what NATO should do in certain areas. Should it expand here? Should it spend more money here? And when you look at the board of directors of the Atlantic Council, it becomes absolutely clear what this organization is. So, for instance, on their board include people like Henry Kissinger, Bush-era apparatchiks like Condoleezza Rice. Colin Powell was on there until he died recently. Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense. There's also multiple very high-ranking US generals on there. For instance, General Wesley Clark, who you mentioned previously. Mad Dog Mattis is on there. Yeah, there's a General Petraeus. Also on there are no fewer than 7 former CIA directors as well. And there's also a spattering of big business leaders and also European government leaders as well. So in short, the Atlantic Council is basically the collective brains of the national security states of European and North American nations. This is pretty worrying because they not only have put out some of the most farcical and ludicrous reports about Russia and China over the last 5 or 6 years, which have really provided the basis for the sort of ramping up of tensions against those two countries. The Atlantic Council famously wrote a series of reports called the Kremlin's Trojan Horses, in which they attacked pretty much every non-centrist political movement, whether it's right-wing or left-wing in Europe, and claiming that they were secretly either in the pay of Vladimir Putin or doing his bidding. So, for instance, Labour under Corbyn was tarred like that. So was UKIP under Nigel Farage. In Spain, Podemos was tarred like that, and so was Vox. In Greece, the left-wing Syriza party was labeled as the Kremlin Trojan horse, as was the right-wing Golden Dawn party. So we've got this situation where the Atlantic Council is really pumping out an awful lot of highly dubious assertions going on. And yet, the Atlantic Council itself has one of the most important organizations in deciding what we see in our news feeds day after day. The Atlantic Council has partnered with Twitter in the past and advised it on what accounts to promote and what sources of information it should suppress. But perhaps most importantly, it's got a formal partnership with Facebook, in which it helps curate the news feeds of nearly 3 billion people worldwide. And as I said, when an organization like this, which has got all of these heads of state and national security leaders on its board, when this is the organization that is deciding what people see in their news feeds, and let's remember, 40% of Americans use Facebook primarily for news. This means that we basically have a system of worldwide state censorship, but nobody seems to really know what's going on. We still think of the internet as this more or less free place where the free flow of ideas isn't really hampered very much. But in fact, what we've seen over the last few years is governments around the world really taking an interest in actively regulating what people see and hear online. And the Atlantic Council has been an absolutely key part of that.
Yes, and also when Jeremy Corbyn, towards the election in 2019, revealed US plans for further privatization of the NHS, of course, Atlantic Council and Ben Nemo, if I remember correctly, were instrumental in tarring what Corbyn did as being leaked from Russian intelligence. Of course, this is, in essence, the spreading of misinformation. And as you've said, clearly there is this revolving door relationship between NATO and NATO linked bodies and big tech. And I think it's also important for people to remember that you have actually the director of trust and safety at Google for the whole world is Ben Render, who was employed by NATO as a strategic planner and information manager. Also, when we look at a company like TikTok, who are very important for what young people see and how they understand the world, you have literally the live stream policy manager for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at TikTok, Greg Anderson, formerly worked in psychological operations for NATO. In addition to that, you have the current content policy lead at TikTok, Alexander Corbell, is simultaneously the president of the NATO Association for Canada. So, really, it seems that these connections never seem to end. Well, you've also looked at previously links that Twitter has to a particular military security think tank. Could you tell us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, sure. Just I'll add one more example of the Atlantic Council as well. The director of policy at Reddit, Jessica Ashu, was a former quite high-ranking member of the Atlantic Council as well, and she jumped ship between from her role where she was. It sounds, frankly, like she was organizing the dirty war against Syria on behalf of the UAE government. And she jumped ship into this senior position in Reddit, which was a completely left field career move, which really surprised a lot of people. I think when you were talking about Twitter specifically, I think you were talking about the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, that's usually known by its acronym ASPI. ASPI has, for the last few years, been producing reports for Twitter and becoming increasingly close to the Silicon Valley giant. They've been producing reports about, fake bots and which accounts are spreading false information and that sort of thing. The thing is that when you look at ASPI, they tend to only ever seem to find bots in enemy countries of the United States. So they find Iranian bots, they find tens of thousands of Chinese bots, Russian bots, Venezuelan bots, but they never seem to find bot networks in the United States or in Britain or in Germany or France. And there's one pretty big reason for that, is that ASPI is operated and funded by big defense companies. It's also directly funded by the United States government and the United States military. And it's also staffed with some of the most hawkish anti-China and pro-Cold War components of the Australian military and intelligence services. So we have a situation in Australia where pretty mainstream politicians and diplomats are really sounding the alarm bell that this think tank is really pushing the charge towards war with China inside of Australia. And yet online, they're also having this extremely influential position whereby they are now partnering with Twitter to decide what is true and what is false and who should be suppressed and who should be promoted. And so I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are now starting to feel like Twitter itself is basically a state-affiliated media network. If you're on social media, you've probably seen people, Chinese government officials or Russians or Venezuelans or Iranians with the label, the warning sign, state-affiliated media below them. And yet you never see that with the BBC or with Deutsche Welle in Germany or with PBS in the United States or anything like that. And I think that's really what's going on here. There is a power play going on silently from these big think tanks, which are themselves representatives of the militaries and the national security states. There's a big power play on their behalf trying to seize back control over the means of communication, which they lost in the 2000s with the opening up of the internet.
Yes, I mean, it has to be said that comparatively, algorithmically, Twitter is not quite as bad as others, it seems. But of course, as somebody has mentioned in the comments, Scott Ritter's Twitter account recently got suspended. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the head of editorial for Twitter, Gordon Macmillan, is actually a part of the British military psychological warfare unit, the 77th Brigade. And when that information came out, there was really not much response from either Twitter or from Gordon Macmillan at the 77th Brigade. So it seems to be quite an unproblematized relationship there. Now, you know, Alan, we are of course awaiting the comeback of your Fringe. I would urge you, if the Fringe does try to reappear, not to deprive us of it. Now, the next question that I want to get into is, you have a piece that you put out towards the beginning of the Russian operation in Ukraine. And what you pointed out was that literally on the same day that it happened, the United States bombed Somalia, which it has been doing since 2007. You saw the Israelis launch missile attacks against Syria, as they do fairly regularly. And of course, Saudi Arabia hit Yemen with 37 separate airstrikes. Now, what do you think it is, if we can just sort of juxtapose these wars, which are sort of presented as business as usual, and this particular war in Ukraine? If you could just juxtapose them for us, and definitely sort of the presentation, because also in your brilliant piece, which is on MintPress, you also look at the amount of times that these wars were mentioned on Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and NBC. You know, you found, for example, this is really an amazing stat. You found in that week between February 21st and February 27th that those news platforms ran almost 1,300 separate stories on Ukraine, and a measly 2 stories on Syria, 1 story on Somalia, and literally none at all on the Saudi-led war on Yemen, despite the fact that you'd seen over 37 airstrikes take place in Yemen on one day by the Saudis. Could you just tell us a bit about that, please, Alan?
Yeah, sure. So I was really struck by the fact that there seemed to be so little coverage of all of these other atrocities going around. So, you know, obviously, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's clearly an atrocity that needs to be talked about, covered in great detail. But there are also other ones going on around the world at the same time. As you said, Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen. The United States restarted its bombing campaign against Somalia on that day as well. And Israel was launching airstrikes into Syria, quite close to the capital Damascus, and also in the southwest of the country. And yet, as you said, what I found was when I started analyzing Fox News, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and MSNBC, I found 1,298 articles in that week detailing the Russian attack on Ukraine, and combined only 3 for the other 3 in total. And, you know, I come out of an academic background, particularly of media studies. And one of these seminal works of media studies is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. And it's really one of the great sort of like methodological, if I can say that word correctly, tomes of how to really understand how media decide what to cover and what not to cover. So in terms of wars and atrocities, Herman and Chomsky say that basically there are two factors which decide which atrocities get put on the front page and which get ignored. And the two factors are very simple. Number one, who is doing the killing? Who is the bad guy in that situation? So if the bad guy is an official enemy, that will get much more play. If the bad guy is us or our friends, that will get much less play. And number two is who is the victim in this sense. So if the victim is our friend or if it's us, then we will expect to see that on the front pages, leading the news for days and days, weeks and weeks. But if the victim is our enemies, then it's very unlikely that we will even see pictures, let alone stories of what's going on. And Herman and Chomsky used this back in the 70s and 80s to compare two genocides that were going on at the same time. The one in Cambodia, which was done by an official enemy, and the one in Indonesia against the people of East Timor, which was the United States and the UK's one of their best allies in the region. And what they found was the Cambodian one was talked about at length, constantly, across a wide range of mainstream media outlets. But as the genocide in Timor rose to an absolute crescendo, to the point where the Indonesian military actually ran out of bullets and had to get special shipments sent by air by the Carter administration, as that was going on, the coverage of that was literally zero in the United States press. And that's what's going on today with Ukraine. So with Russia and Ukraine, Russia is the bad guy. Clearly, the West does not like Vladimir Putin. I don't think I'm, breaking any news there. And Ukraine is our ally. It's trying to join the EU. It's trying to join NATO. So we've got the perfect situation whereby Russia is the bad guy and Ukraine is the good guy. So it gets covered 1,300 times in a week. But the other three, the Saudi attack on Yemen, the US attack on Somalia, and the Israeli attack on Syria, the bad guy, the perpetrator there is either the United States itself or its close ally in terms of Saudi Arabia or Israel. And the bad guys there are what the United States government calls terrorists, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or the government of Bashar al-Assad, or the groups in Somalia that it was targeting. And so therefore, that gets absolutely no clicks, it gets no articles or anything. There's no interest from corporate media, precisely because there's no political utility in pointing these things out, because it would actually start getting people to question their own government's actions. And that's certainly not what corporate media wants to do. So in terms of, you'll never see pictures of Syrian civilians getting bombed by Israelis. You won't see huge campaigns trying to, raise money or send weapons to Yemen to fight off the Saudi hordes. And you won't, be encouraged to send money to Somalia to try to, defeat the US government there. That's simply not going to happen because there's no political utility in it. And so ultimately, we'd like to think of the world as being a fair place, but ultimately what we're invited to see as an atrocity depends entirely on who's doing it and who is the victim.
Yeah, and you also will, without a doubt, not see footage of children born with cancers and deformities in Fallujah today, believed to be because of the depleted uranium dropped on that place by the US military. Now, in your piece, you use the quote, "first major war between civilized nations." Now, Manar is going to kindly play a video for us, which will expand on that a little bit more. And then it would be great to get your input on that, Alan.
Happened in the last refugee crisis in Europe back in 2015. Poland was one of the EU countries that, was hesitant to take in refugees. Talk about what has changed.
Just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white, they're...
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
When you look at what
I mean, of course, Ukraine being the poorest country in Europe. So, aside from the seeming implicit racism, it's interesting also because, without a doubt, Britain should be giving refuge to Britain occupied 14 million miles of the planet. It should be giving refuge to Ukrainians and to anyone else that wants it. But we do seem to have assurances that you will not see Ukrainians sent to Rwanda anytime soon. If you can just expand on that small portion there, Alan.
Yeah, I was genuinely shocked by a lot of the coverage coming out of Ukraine, but if I'm really honest, I wasn't that surprised because ultimately, I think we have to think of racism a little bit more deeply than just some guys wearing hoods or some people flying swastika flags. This is really the sort of more acceptable, much more ingrained racism that that really exists within Western societies for a lot of people. And we see that, nice liberal commentators who would be absolutely aghast if Donald Trump called Haiti a shithole country, as he did a couple of years ago, but don't really seem to bat an eyelid when they see, thousands of Yemeni refugees trying to, flee their town because it's being bombed. But yet the heartstrings really get pulled on when they see white people from Ukraine, as the CBS reporter Charlie DeGatta said, a relatively civilized country, not like Iraq or Afghanistan, which really shows just how ignorant he is, because of course Iraq was the cradle of civilization, the incredible civilizations like the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians, and all of this was really like the basis of modern society. But it's also clearly, if you think about it, it's actually like a sly dig at the Ukrainians as well, because he says they're only relatively civilized, they are still Slavs, but at least they're, white passing. So perhaps they're relatively civilized. And I think it really shows that despite the fact that a lot of the 19th century views on race and racial hierarchy have gone out of fashion, at least in the way that we're not really supposed to talk about them, they are still actually ingrained in our society. And this sort of media coverage is a great way of showing that to be the case.
You also point out in one of your pieces, Alan, the way in which at the outset of the US invasion of Afghanistan, 20-year war, the war on terror, which entailed the average of 46 bombs dropped per day for 20 years by the US military, that you even had the chairman of CNN sending a memo to CNN staff advising essentially that they downplay the suffering of Afghans. Could you expand a bit on that, please, Alan?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately, I think this episode in Ukraine, as terrible as it is, we can learn some things from it. And one of the things that we can learn is that if media wanted to do their job and wanted to be anti-war and wanted to actually stop atrocities, they could do this all the time. And in fact, that is a choice that they're making every day, not to show the victims of British bombs or American bombs, wherever they fall, whether that's in Iraq or Pakistan or Yemen or Libya or wherever it is. If these reporters actually went to the hospitals in those countries and saw what was going on there, like they're doing in Kiev and Kharkiv and Odessa right now, that there would quite possibly be a revolution in our countries overnight, as people would simply absolutely refuse to be part of a system that bombs millions of people around the world globally every year. And so ultimately, media is a really powerful force for change in our society. But ultimately, the people at the top who actually control these news organizations know that. And that memo that you quoted from the head of CNN sending it out at the start of the Afghan war, which said it, quote, seems perverse to focus too much on the casualties or hardship in Afghanistan, unquote, really shows that to be the case. These are pro-war outlets that know their role, and their role is ultimately to support empire and support the views of the people at the very top of society. And that's why people call media outlets the prime vehicle for manufacturing public consent for the policies of the elite, which are very often, in fact, most of the time, the strict opposite of the interests of most of us at the bottom.
I mean, just to sort of juxtapose it all to what has happened across these years in Yemen, we are talking about the world's largest and most desperate humanitarian crisis. You know, the poorest people in the world being bombed by the richest states in the region, who are backed by some of the richest countries in the world. You know, nearly a third of all of the strikes have hit civilian targets. You've got 10 million people there facing famine. You've got 80% of the population requiring humanitarian assistance, and 80% of the population of Yemen is 24 million people. You know, the rates of acute malnutrition of children under 5 are the highest ever recorded in human history. It's been estimated that 98,000 children under the age of 5 in Yemen are at risk of dying without urgent treatment. You've got 250,000 pregnant or breastfeeding women also at risk of dying without urgent treatment in Yemen. I mean, and Save the Children, a nice, respectable charity, estimated that for every one child killed by bombs and bullets in Yemen, dozens are starving to death. And that's because of the policy of blockade that we have seen at the port of Hodeidah and in other places. You know, and it's, you know, a fact that starvation is considered a war crime. You know, the depriving of civilians of objects which are indispensable to their survival. And we've seen that play out on a very widespread industrial scale in Yemen, actually. And across this time, we've seen Britain's prize arms company, which the royal family has so dutifully served, BAE Systems, selling over 15 billion pounds worth of arms to Saudi during the bombing of Yemen. We also know that you've had literally UK-made fighter jets driven by pilots who have been trained by the UK, dropping UK-made bombs. We were told that there were no UK personnel on the ground in Yemen, but actually the Daily Mail revealed that there were special forces soldiers wounded there, clearly making it apparent that there is British involvement on the ground. Also, a BAE Systems worker said that if it wasn't for BAE Systems involvement in maintenance of the jets and other things, then within 7 to 14 days, there wouldn't be a jet in the sky. You know, we have seen those airstrikes hit markets, funerals, weddings, detention facilities, civilian boats, and even medical facilities. It's believed that the farms in Yemen have been bombed over 1,000 times. And, you know, literally only 49% of the public in Britain even know that the war in Yemen is happening. Now, you have argued that the United States is a quote unquote direct participant in the violence in Yemen. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty defensible statement, frankly. Since the war in Yemen started, the United States, according to data that I compiled from the Defense Department's own website, has sold, and this is slightly out of date now, but has sold an absolute bare minimum of $28.4 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. I was actually on that website this week and found they've also put through another 1.5 billion since then. So we're talking at very, very least $30 billion worth of weaponry. And that's the lower bound of it. The upper bound of that figure is actually closer to $60 billion. So they're not only funding the Saudi war machine, 74% of Saudi Arabia's weapons come from the United States. And of the rest of that quarter, about half of it comes from Great Britain, so 12% in total. France comes in 4%, and no other country is above 2%. So this is really the United States and the United Kingdom funding this Saudi-led onslaught on Yemen. But they're not only just funding, they're not only just selling them the weapons, they're also defending the Saudi government in regional and international organizations like the United Nations, which has attempted to take some action against the main belligerents in this conflict, which could, reasonably be called a massacre. The United Nations calls it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, and estimated that by the end of 2021, 377,000 Yemenis have died in that conflict since its beginning. The United States also provides training for the Saudi Air Force so they know how to use these jets. We also know that the United States refuels Saudi jets while they're in the air so they can carry out more strikes. We also know that the United States military is involved in target selection as well. So they are choosing the targets that the Saudi government is attacking. And Oxfam actually did a study that found that the Saudi Arabian government carry out the equivalent of one attack every 10 days on Yemen's medical and water facilities. So it's not surprising that Yemen basically doesn't have a sewage network or any sort of functioning healthcare system. And because of that, huge numbers of people are dying from entirely preventable diseases like cholera or diarrhea, which is an absolute international tragedy and scandal, and should be being talked about at least as much as what's going on in Ukraine, because of course we actually have the power to stop that. Somebody like Boris Johnson or somebody like Joe Biden could get on the phone tomorrow and pretty much stop this within days, whereas when it comes to Ukraine, that's a much more complicated matter. That's something that Russian anti-war activists have to deal with. So ultimately, I've argued that the United States and Britain are not, neutral observers in this, but are in fact direct participants. They are doing absolutely everything except pulling the trigger themselves. And who knows, maybe it will come out one day via leaked files that they're even doing that as well.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alan. And just before we go, it's no secret that I am currently the subject of a campaign to remove my music from Spotify. But, you've done work in the past on a particular Israel lobby group with involvement in the music industry, the Creative Community for Peace organization. It would be great if you could just give people a bit of the vital information that they should know about the Creative Community for Peace.
Yeah, I touched on this in my article about J.K. Rowling and anti-Semitism. I think the main points of interest here is that Creative Community for Peace was really established to counter the mounting international criticism of Israel and the increasing support for the BDS movement. Creative Community for Peace was very closely interconnected with a group called Stand With Us. For instance, between 2011 and 2013, if you wanted to donate to Creative Community for Peace, you actually had to do it via Stand With Us. The founder of Creative Community for Peace, David Resner, his wife Esther Resner is actually the co-founder of Stand With Us. And I think it's no secret, frankly, that Stand With Us is an openly pro-Israel organization which is used to advance the Israeli government's interests. In fact, the former Israeli deputy foreign minister and the ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon, actually said that explicitly. He said, and I quote, "It's true, we are using Stand With Us for leverage." So ultimately, we have this group called Creative Community for Peace, which is an association of pro-Israel artists or producers or musicians or people just generally involved in those creative industries. And they talk about how we shouldn't shun Israel. We should, in fact, talk to them. We should engage in dialogue. And only by going to Israel and showing, them how great the West is and, doing shows there, etc., will we ever get them to change. But of course, even saying something like we have to engage in dialogue fundamentally breaks the concept of BDS. So they're kind of smuggling in BDS under the auspices or the talk of being open and trying to change from within. But in fact, when you actually look at their sources of funding and the people who are on their boards, I think quite frankly this sort of thing falls apart. So yeah, it's just one of a myriad of organizations which has been set up in order to support the expansionist policies of the State of Israel.
Yes, and Creative Community for Peace was founded as part of the Israel Emergency Alliance. So technically, in its tax filings, the same organization as Stand With Us, which is now funded directly by the Israeli Prime Minister's office. It was founded, Creative Community for Peace, by David Renzer, who was the CEO of publishing at Universal Music Group. He is, of course, the husband of the founder of Stand With Us. Creative Community for Peace has the support of many different figures on the executive level of the music industry. In addition to that, we also know that Creative Community for Peace has coordinated directly with the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles, with even the consulate general in Los Angeles going as far as saying, David Siegel, the consul general for Israel in Los Angeles, saying Creative Community for Peace are effective because they work from inside the industry. They have gained a lot of resonance, and they are essentially the only organization focused on the cultural boycott. So, that has been a brilliant live stream today. We have dipped in and out of some really interesting pieces of information and some really important organizations. Essentially, what we are looking at is coercion through the disguising of agency, and it's something that all of Alan's work looks at really deeply. So I would encourage everyone who has seen this live stream to follow Alan's work, to follow MintPress, to support MintPress, because as I say, we are very much the last of a dying breed. What is happening with independent media in this world, in the English language, is really quite extraordinary. We are seeing day by day people dropping off and not able to continue to sustain their investigative journalism because of these big tech companies. So I would urge you in the strongest possible terms to support MintPress, to sign up to the Patreon, and to support brilliant journalists like Alan. Thank you very much to Manar, who has assisted us throughout this live stream, and we hope to see you on the Watchdog next week. Thank you very much.